the April Cleveland Tableau user group. Today we will be covering scatterplots and how to design difficult charts like a data viz professional by none other than Steve Fenn. He is a Tableau solutions architect at Action Analytics, and we'll have Steve introduce himself in a bit. So again, our host today, our guest speaker, is Steve Fenn. And you can read about Steve. It might be easier if Steve introduces himself, if you're cool with that, Steve.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Steve Fenn. I've been using Tableau for about a decade now, as a hobby throughout that time, and as a main part of my job the first few years, and pretty much my only job the last 6. I've been teaching Tableau classes, consulting to companies, building dashboards for them, guiding their Tableau users and developers on best practices. And I just really enjoy data analysis and data visualization. It's really nice to have both my hobby and my job be the same thing. And I came up with this presentation because I've seen scatterplots misused so often by myself, especially early in my career, and by others as well. But I've also seen some really effective uses of this visualization type, and I like walking through the ways that we can leverage them to their best power.
Excellent, thank you. So I think with that, and Steve, you're located in Denver, is that right?
I am, yes.
All right, awesome. I think I've been once. Oh no, I've been out there, and I've been skiing in Colorado.
Right.
But I don't think I've ever properly visited Denver. It's not definitely on my to-do list.
Oh, one of the highlights is to just fly into the Denver airport and then get straight to the mountains. That's understood.
Yeah. The skiing was great. We went to Breckenridge. But,
excellent.
So I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll just quickly get it over to Steve whenever you're ready, Steve.
Absolutely. All right, well, we'll be jumping back and forth between my slides and the interactive Tableau dashboards here that I'm using as illustrations. But again, we're looking at scatterplot challenges. The image on the left here is one you can throw together in Tableau in 3 minutes. The one on the right is using the exact same data, but taking some design approaches that can make it a lot more effective and intuitive for an audience. And we'll look at a few examples of good and bad, all from my catalog in Tableau Public, and see where things went wrong early in my career on scatterplots and where they can go right. And also talk about a lot of uses of scatterplots that don't need to be in front of an audience. In many ways, these charts are most effective in your initial exploratory analysis when you're doing discovery on your data. And maybe that informs some of your data shaping, some of your approach to other analytics. And they don't actually see it, the XY axes plotting all these dots out in a chart. So quickly, let's talk about some pros and cons of scatterplots just as a foundation of this discussion. The biggest difficulties with scatterplots are that often they're hard to understand. And this is especially the case when people in your audience don't have a statistics education. You know, those of us that have taken stats classes, have lived in data, we understand what our square value is. We understand p-values and the weaknesses of trying to interpret them and yada, yada. But, you know, you put a best fit line in front of someone that hasn't been taking those courses or doesn't live in data, they're not going to be very helpful. It's really easy in a scatterplot to just kind of have this mishmash of a lot of data points that maybe you understand, but you haven't conveyed the context to the audience. And this one's both a strength and a weakness. They require some time to explore and interpret. And so understanding that as a core aspect of scatterplots can help you avoid some of the bad applications of them and guide you towards some better approaches. And you just got to keep in mind, sometimes the scatter plot points something out to you, but maybe you should be transitioning to another type of chart for the particular message you need to be conveying to your audience. The strengths of scatter plots, and they're there for exploring a relationship between metrics. That's what they do with regression analysis. You can also find hotspots in the distribution of your data between those X and Y axes. You can quickly find outliers. Now, this can be a big part in exploratory analysis. Maybe you discover a data error through a scatter plot, and that informs how you circle back in Tableau Prep, Alteryx, or in the worst case, Excel, and get rid of those outliers that shouldn't have been there in the first place. You can also look at some similarities between data points, highlight ranges of a ratio. Exploratory analysis, again, is the core strength of these, in my opinion. But let's look at some examples of that. Here's a little bit more of those two examples. The one on the left, you throw together quickly. Maybe you interpret it and find something useful. You know, you're putting shots on X-axis, goals on the Y-axis, the team drives the color, and you size it by minutes. Yeah, you can probably explore that if you know this soccer data and find something interesting within here. But you stick that one in front of an audience, and most of them are going to say, what? On the right, I've taken the exact same data. I've been more liberal with my approach to filtering, so you see less of these tiny outliers, and more intentional in how I've approached color, background, text to try to get some information across. And we'll look at more detail of this in just a minute. In a lot of ways, scatterplot design to me circles back to core data visualization questions and how we should be approaching data viz so that we're effective for our audience. So what questions is the audience going to want us to ask of the data through our visualizations? And what follow-up questions are they likely to ask? My general rule of thumb is that one dashboard should have one central question. And then the expected follow-up questions are how you organize tooltips and other interactive features. If you try to answer more questions than that, you try to tell somebody everything, you're probably just confusing them and telling them nothing. What chart types is your audience used to consuming, and how much statistical education do they have? So if your audience for your visualization is a data science team, maybe that's a case in which you can go a little bit more into the weeds in R-squared values and other statistical properties where they're more likely to understand it. But if you're creating for executives, be careful. Will these visualizations be consumed as flat images in a PowerPoint, or are they going to be in Tableau server where your audience is going to explore it interactively? This is a huge one in terms of scatter plots, because in most situations, a scatter plot needs interactivity and it needs some time for consumption because of the nature of how that visualization has so many data points in it and needs that exploratory work on the audience side as well as on your side for it to use its full potential. Can this view help you identify trends and outliers for your analysis and data management issues? Again, always back to exploratory analysis, in my opinion, when we're talking about scatter plots. That's the best case scenario. So let's look at a bad example. This one I made 9 years ago. I was looking at Major League Soccer data, and it was part of the way through the season, and everybody was talking on Twitter about all these teams on the outside with the small icons. And I said, well, this is just a regression to the mean. Everybody ends up towards the center of this distribution. And I think all these tiny ones are just look a lot worse or a lot better than they actually are at this early point of the season. And I thought I was conveying that in the way that I made these scatter plots and presented them. The other problems with this course, I was cramming in all these tables and everything else. It's not very well designed on any level, really. And there's also just because you can doesn't mean you should aspect of custom shapes showing up here. Major League Soccer fans in 2013 might have found some of these logos intuitive, but those that don't follow the league, probably not. And with the partial translucency of it, you can't tell what the heck is going on in the middle here. So as an alternative, this one I'm using a lot more designed thought and implementation. I organized this scatter plot to focus on the ratio between shots and goals, which can be a key question in soccer analytics. You know, how often is a shot actually scoring? And so we've got the color scheme backing up that ratio. We're down here at the purple. We've got less than 5% of their shots are scoring. Probably some midfielders shooting off shots way over the goal from 30 yards out on a regular basis. All the way up to the yellow here, where you've got the very efficient strikers that are scoring on 1 out of 5 shots or more. And so I'm using a continuous color scheme. It might not be one that all of you are familiar with. This one is called Bivariate. It's shown to be a highly consumable color scheme, even if someone were to be colorblind. But you could also use this approach on a single color palette that's ramping up, or a dual color palette. Say if you had an acceptable range above 15% and unacceptable range below 10% in your particular data, you might have a neutral gray in that 10 to 15%, and then shades of orange or shades of blue above or below that range. The background is just a lighter, more translucent tone of the actual data points here. And I'm using that same color for labeling these ratios. I've also got a highlighter in the interactive version for finding a player. And I've got little animations when you go between seasons. So what does that look like in practice? Here's the interactive version in Tableau Public. I could go find a player, find his specifics in a tooltip. Always think about using your tooltips in a nicely designed way. You see, I'm not holding on to the standard Tableau approach of just listing off all the dimensions and the measures. I'm using sizing of text and bold to try to draw attention to the important parts. And we can navigate to specific seasons and see some of those dots move around for players that were in both of those seasons. Go back to all time here and try to find a specific player. There's Zlatan Ibrahimovic up here. Again, the interactive is often a very big part of how an effective scatter plot can work. Also, in terms of the design here, I have to give a shout out to Radi Zakovic. He originally came up with a design scheme like this around some NBA data. Go Cavs. I hope they beat the Nets tonight. I do believe Mobley is the rookie of the year. But Roddy came up with an NBA version of this. I saw it and spun it off into this MLS data. And again, you want to be very thoughtful about your approach to design when you're making a scatter plot. Back to a case in which I was not very thoughtful. Leading into a World Cup, I wanted to look at players in terms of their age versus their market value and try to figure out if I could get a feel for how different teams are approaching their World Cup rosters. And I just ended up with a bunch of flags on top of each other that even I have no idea what's going on in this thing anymore. Just cramming in lots of text. And you also see a lot of times in my bad examples, I'm putting a relatively complicated measure, or in worst case dimension, onto the size shelf. And you end up with these tiny ones you can barely see. You can't really tell any nuance between the values that's driving this tooltip. Not a great approach. And translucent flags might be even worse than translucent football team logos. Like these ones, just they overlap. You don't know what's going on whatsoever. As opposed to this one, which I worked with alongside one of my data visualization students, Derek Inson. And we entered this in a Seattle Sounders data visualization contest and came away with an honorable mention, in which we were trying to profile Major League Soccer players. And we had a few different metrics that we wanted to get some feel for, where we can look at their expected goals, their expected assists, the two combined, number of shots and key passes, and expected placement of their shots. And so we came up with this approach where we've got a scatter plot as our primary, and then distribution plots here as our secondary views, with similar design approaches throughout. We've got reference bands that are the same color with the white in the middle for the median. We're using what's called a density plot, again leveraging Bivariate, and then zero lines as well are the same on all of them. So we bring it together as a cohesive unit. Also got some interactive elements I'll show you in a moment for selecting teams, finding players. Let's take a look at that. We'll look at our two Ohio teams here. Here's Cincinnati. Here's Columbus. And so I'm using this bold pink to make it really easy to find those important data points. And then if I want to focus on one particular player, I can click on him and get the highlight throughout the whole thing with simple Tableau highlight actions. Again, I can search for the arrogant one. There's Lawton. And I use a little parameter hack to get a refresh button here. And I go extremely simple in this case on the tooltips themselves. Let that just tell you who the player is, and then let labels that only show up when they've got a highlight to them do the other work that a tooltip normally would. So there's example number 2. Back to some early career struggles. Here I was trying to look at the relationship between wages and results. Or you might, in a professional environment, look at budget versus results in some similar way. The reality I was trying to convey here, and this one's more effective than some of my other bad examples, is to show that in Europe, where there is no salary cap in soccer leagues, the budget tends to drive the results. These teams up here spend the most, they get the best results, or at least the ones in this range of budget are really just competing with each other for that part of the table. Maybe get a couple here in the mid tier that can tick up into that range a little bit in the standings. And then all the poorer teams are down here fighting with each other to avoid relegation, which, if you don't know European soccer, is pretty important. The bottom 3 teams tend to go down to the second division, and then the top 3 teams from that group move up the next year. Whereas in Major League Soccer, the salary cap, where if you spend big on some players, it means you need to go cheaper on the other players. The overall budget doesn't make as much of a difference. You've got a much flatter trend line. You've got a much more random distribution throughout the scatter plot. And so you end up with this situation where, yeah, you've got some good teams with high wages, but you've also got some middling ones here that aren't really taking advantage of that budget very well. And you've got some in the middle budget area that are bad. This is my modern update of that. And there's some good and some bad. I don't have a counterpoint from Europe to go straight up against this. Part of the reason for that is I had some bad data practices here where I'm using very different data sources. You might notice that in my attribution here. Wanted to stay away from that problem and just focus on Major League Soccer and show the randomness here. A central difficulty, though, if you're trying to convey a lack of a relationship, you're going to have a hard time getting past your audience's confirmation bias. And so I've certainly thrown this out there, and people have consumed it, and their eyes just go to the top right and the bottom left and say, well, we'll see, the biggest segments are this 42 here in low wage bad results and 36 in the high wage good results. Not recognizing, yeah, those are larger, but they're not that big, especially compared to how you might see it in one of those European leagues. I've used a bivariate color scheme, same as the little diamond you see behind me here, where you've got the midpoint of different colors along a diamond are dictating how all this whole thing lays out. And so I'm going with good blue in the top right, kind of the most embarrassing category of high wage bad results in the bottom right with the pink. But there's a lot going on here, and it's not something that I'm totally thrilled with in terms of how well it connects with an audience, but it was something that I felt was worth exploring and trying to dig in and get some insights across. Let's take a look at the interactive version of that real quick. Trying to use text in a way that doesn't gum things up. I put a little for statisticians disclaimer next to the R² value. So, non-nerds can kind of ignore it. I put an explainer on why the axes are the way they are. It's a little bit complicated, but essentially the y-axis is points per game, because different MLS seasons have different numbers of games. You don't want raw counts when normalization would help. And then the bottom axis had to be normalized relative to the median payroll of that season, because MLS wages have gone up a lot over the years. And if I didn't do that, you'd end up with some of those seasons 2007, where the team was outspending all its competition quite a bit, looking like they're more towards the middle of the distribution. I also went with a log scale, because in that lower tooltip visualization, you'll see just how crammed in everything would look if I didn't go with the log scale. Be careful with log scales generally. I try to talk people through this one more often than I just hand it to them, because there are all these little nuances that have to be discussed to properly interpret what's going on in a graph that's this complex. But again, styling the tooltips a little bit, make them more striking than just your standard listing dimensions, listing measures that Tableau is going to hand you. You'll also notice that you rarely see in my interactive visualizations the keep only, exclude buttons up at the top of the tooltips. And I will show you why. If I had those in here, the include command buttons, and my audience came to this dashboard and was looking at these and just kind of, they just kind of clicked and clicked a second time. My annotations get a little bit in the way of me illustrating this, but I've seen people accidentally click keep only, and you end up with that happening, and the audience is thoroughly confused. Don't give them that chance. You'll also see sometimes with that sort of filtering, your calculations break and you end up with different colors than you had envisioned. Unless the audience needs and deserves the power available within command buttons, my recommendation is always turn them off. Just a little side note and Tableau pet peeve that I wanted to make sure I got across. One more example of more recent design of a scatter plot from me. Again, I'm using a bivariate color scheme here, in which I'm not concerned with linear regression here. This was a Makeover Monday project in which I was given data of home and road attendance for National Hockey League teams. And I created this scatter plot right away. And the regression analysis wasn't interesting other than, yeah, there actually isn't much relationship between home and road attendance for a team. But I thought it would be an interesting thing for somebody to explore and find, you know, somebody who maybe was working with an NHL team would maybe be curious as to why some of these have got really bad home attendance, but draw really well on the road, or vice versa. There could be some really interesting secondary analysis that a team might do of, okay, so how's the other team promoting us that gets us into this corner, and why are we failing, or vice versa? Why is nobody coming to see us on the road when we're able to get people to our home events? So let's look at the interactive version of that. Again, styling these a bit. And if I choose a team, let's go with Columbus. Now I've got larger data points for that team, so it's easier to see what's happening when I try to focus on them. And then another secondary aspect, in hockey, they have every season a winter classic. They might have actually changed the name of that in recent years, where they have a game in an outdoor arena or stadium with huge capacity, and you see full season numbers will actually get skewed a great deal by just that one game. So Toronto has our largest attendance period on the road because they were a road Winter Classic participant in that particular year. And down here, Chicago's got a big boost from being a Winter Classic participant. So I made that one of my parameter options there as well. And I also did a little extra work with some calculations in the subtitle here, where it's pointing you towards that parameter initially. So you choose a team to focus on right here. And then once you've chosen them, it says Carolina seasons are largest. So let me take a look at the chat real quick. Are there any questions coming in just yet? No, just agreement on let's go Cavs. Fair enough.
Yeah, Steve, I think we're actually all set from a Q&A perspective, unless again, please feel free to either enter in the chat or in the Q&A if there are any questions at this point.
Well, I'll just keep going then.
Okay.
But if anyone does have any questions about any of these aspects on the slides or particular visualizations of how I built things, happy to talk about that once we get through the last few slides. So circling back, what are some general scatter plot temptations we need to be aware of? These are not absolute don'ts, but I've seen them lead to problems in many cases. If you leave on the default formatting of the chart itself, of the tooltips, you're not doing yourself any favors. This is a visualization chart type where you really need to be a lot more aware of how you're approaching things. It's not the low-hanging fruit of a bar chart, line chart, map, where everybody knows what that is, kind of knows in a basic way how to interpret it. Scatter plots can take many forms, can be trying to address different data questions. And so you need to be very aware of those things as you're approaching them, or you're not going to communicate effectively. don't think that a best fit line in a regression analysis is going to be enough, especially if you're not presenting to other data science people. What's an R squared mean? Well, those of us who have studied statistics know that you could roughly define it as the percentage to which one of these factors explains the other. Correlation, not causality. But a lot of people in your audience don't even know that much. And even if you do explain that, some of them are going to go, huh? Don't go overboard with the colors. There are certainly some of my good ones that some might say are risking this, but you want to be aware of how people are going to interpret all of your design elements. And if you throw red on there as a meaning of a dimension, people are going to, their eyes are going to gravitate towards that. Same thing with orange. Don't do that unless you're actually trying to guide their eyes towards those particular colors. Don't overuse shapes, particularly in non-intuitive fashion. You know, some of my earlier ones you saw, team logos. Yeah, that can be effective in some cases. If I would usually only do it if that team logo is showing up once, though. Once you get multiple seasons and you've got a lot of Cleveland Guardians logos on there, people are going to be like, wait, what? And also some people might say, wait, it was the Indians in that year, not the Guardians. They get distracted. Keep it simple. Also, be very aware of data point overlaps. There's a lot of times where you create a scatter plot, you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, I kind of see the shape of it. But you don't recognize, okay, so here's all these outliers, and here, this area is 80% of the data points, all on top of each other. And if you're not careful with a density visualization type or transparency, that's going to be totally lost on an audience. Also, if you don't hone in outliers that don't make sense, those overlaps are going to be even more dramatic. Again, always ask yourself, when you're before you put a scatter plot in front of a wide audience, what question am I trying to address here? And would a different chart actually get that across better? Now let's go back to the positive, scatter plot strategies. Again, keep in mind general data visualization principles. You want to reinforce your central data question, and you want to make your chart as intuitive as possible. The ideal for data visualization is that they get to the insights quickly. We want efficiency of interpretation. You want a simple color scheme in your data point, your background that gets your audience's eye in the right direction quickly. Sometimes in certain situations, reference lines and bands can be your friend, either for defining how your analysis is organized, or for drawing their eye toward a particular problematic or good area that they need to be seen. Communicate those overlaps you talked about earlier. If you've got transparency, you probably want to have borders. So if you've got a black ground, maybe a white border, or just even a very subtle black background, black border. You can use the density plot type like I did in that profiling viz with the scatter plot in one area and then the little distribution plots on the side. Intuitive shapes can help, but be careful. Again, really tempting to overuse those, and the intuitive part of this bullet point is vital. If you just throw a dimension onto the shape shelf, you just get, squares and circles and diamonds. Unless square and circle and diamond are representative of that data, it's not going to do much for you. You are probably going to need to use text, including your tooltips, to guide the insights for your audience. When appropriate, lean into regression analysis. But if you're presenting it, ask yourself if that's going to be effective for that particular audience. They'll need to be highly invested. They'll need to actually know what R-squared values and p-values mean, or what's the point? The main strategy I'd recommend again and again is exploratory analysis. When I get new data, I'm almost always throwing it together in a scatter plot and just seeing if outliers pop. Maybe those are data errors I need to address. Seeing if I understand the data. You know, if I've got a good understanding of the dimensions of the measures, then I should be able to put together a scatter plot. And as I change which dimensions drive the data points, ideally, I'm going to understand why the distribution is shifting as it goes. If it doesn't align with my expectations, that's either because I didn't understand the data in the first place, or there's something tricky or underlying there that's an insight that I need to be aware of going forward. But that step can be vital to setting the foundation for an effective dashboard, even if it's not going to use a scatter plot in the end result. Sometimes I have used these as a first step of analysis in a dashboard for an audience that isn't as technical, but they want to see kind of where things lie as they initially filter things down. And then I might have a scatter plot in a collapsible container. They use that to find the interesting stuff. And then I give them a button to shrink that down for the more precise bar charts, line charts, etc., that focus on those data points that they've selected. And again, if you can't get the scatter plot to do what needs to be done, circle back to those data questions and find out if some simpler visualizations are going to do the job a lot better. And then once we get past theoretical, production dashboards, talk about the principle of everything can be a scatter. If you're making data art, this is a tool that can be extremely effective. These are, again, all from my Tableau public profile. Here I've got a scatter plot with a guitar background image in which I'm creating heat maps of Jimi Hendrix songs alongside heat maps of the original song that was inspired it. So we've got Dylan's all along the Watchtower, all single chord progressions. Hendrix is all along the Watchtower, much different animal. On down to Day Tripper and Johnny Be Good. And you can use any visualization type when you're in a scatter. Bar charts can be a little bit weird though. Also, a lot, when you get to know scatter plots well, and you get to know maps well, you'll start to see that in Tableau, in a lot of ways, they're the same thing. A map is essentially a scatter plot, but the latitude and longitude are always the axes, and those axes are always hidden, and there's always a background image. In a technical sense, the only other big differentiator between the two is that you can use filled map visualizations much simpler in a map than you do in a scatter. The other distinction between them at the moment, this is a kind of advanced technique that I haven't gotten into myself, but I've seen others explore in really interesting ways, is that I can't remember which Tableau release rolled this out. You can actually take a map, shape your data in a way that you could actually have a multi-chart dashboard in one view. It's an odd thing to think about in the abstract, but there's some interesting blog posts you could find by Googling where someone has got a map, took away the background map altogether, and they were able to put bar charts here, line charts here, crosstab here, etc., all underlying that coming from latitude and longitude. But it can all be just that singular view. Some pretty interesting possibilities there. My other examples on the screen, I've got these hexagons are actually written based on latitude and longitude polygons. And then in the background, I've got maps of these regions where I've created some outlines in different colors, and then using make line and make point to draw the lines from the country and then the region to the state in which the refugees have landed. This one looks like a map, but is actually a scatter plot. I've got polygons And this was created based on some code that my friend and former colleague Luke Stanke wrote. But it's an actual hemisphere, and you can change the base longitude and latitude of that hemisphere in the dashboard to rotate the globe. And so it draws all these polygons from that perspective in a scatter plot. And then the very simple version of a scatter plot that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a scatter plot is hex maps. You're looking at the layout of data within the 50 states, and especially if you've got Puerto Rico and DC in there, make it easy to actually have enough data ink to convey where those, or maybe Guam or other outlying areas fall. But the number of pixels for those areas can end up being the same as for Texas and California and the other large geographic areas. And in many cases, you look at the viz of the day, you look at Iron Viz. There's going to be a lot of examples of scatter plots, because that is a flexible way for somebody to create a visualization that aligns with their vision. And that's what I've got for now. Happy to answer questions. Again, my name is Steve Fenn. I'm a data visualization architect for Action Analytics. We provide dashboards, training, etc. in Tableau. Also do a lot of work in other data management and data shaping areas. You can, if you're watching the recording of this, my Twitter handle is @stathunting. I'll probably see mentions of that faster than if you go to my LinkedIn, but I check those notifications semi-regularly as well. You could also email me, steve@actionanalytics.com. For now, any questions from the live audience?
So I'll give people an opportunity, again, within the Q&A and within the chat to either offer commentary or ask a question. Steve, I have a few comments and questions for you. So first of all, I just want to give you a resounding thank you for doing this today. I myself learned a lot, and I'm appreciative for your time. I really appreciated that you showed and presented some of your old work and how you iterated and how you made it better today. So having the initial one with the one that you've developed over time and how you've worked towards it is really helpful, I think, for anyone that's either starting in their Tableau journey or even later in their Tableau journey. I know I myself, I have some stuff on Tableau Public that I would love to go back and clean up, and it's on my to-do list, but I definitely want to get there one day. I guess one of the comments, well, a few other things, is that Veritas color palette, I think, was a nice touch, and having that available and knowing that that is available for those that might have color blindness was very useful. Well, oh, the other thing that I appreciated you stating was knowing your audience, right? And knowing your audience's, I guess, capabilities in terms of understanding scatter plots and how they can be complex. So it might not be something that you want to just hand off and say, here it is, go find your insights. Right. Or you might actually want to explain and have a sit-down conversation with those that you're using. That will be potential end users. So I thought that was very, very good. I guess one question I have for you is, when it comes to overlapping, I've seen, especially utilizing R, I've seen jittering techniques. Do you utilize those, or do you prefer to do the overlapping and the transparency to show that there's density there?
Yeah, I've gone both directions. So, I mean, it certainly would have been a possibility on a chart like this to have gone with a jitter instead of going with density. In this particular example, I stuck with the density plot because I also had the scatter in place, and that was already using the same design techniques. But in a lot of cases, using random and I've seen a lot of different iterations on jitter. Rather than being random jitter, I've seen people kind of have a count up and then starting over the count up or something like that. There's a lot of different possibilities there, but I don't think another approach that could sometimes be useful if somebody really needed to dig in on where the overlaps are, is you could potentially have a filter around a certain radius. So if my major point of some of these was to find out what's happening down here of the players that aren't producing, where all that overlap is, maybe in my tooltip actions, I'd have a link that said, focus on players who are plus minus 0.05 on both measures of Bornstein here. And then we'd end up filtering and zooming in on those. In a case like this, the answer is just, well, those are defenders. So not very, very useful to do that. But yeah, there's certainly other possibilities. While we're on the subject, though, of possibilities here, I'd like to point out how you get Viritus very easily in a density plot. In fact, let me do it from the scatter plot itself, since that's our topic today. If I go to our scatter plot here, if I wasn't on density, I could potentially just have circles. And then I could play around with the opacity here and kind of get a feel for, okay, well, there's overlap down here. But it's a greater gap between looking at the chart and getting the insight, in my opinion, to take that approach in this case. But sometimes that's sufficient. But once I choose density and I click on color, now I can choose how it's going to orient that density. But generally, it's going to default to blue, which in my opinion isn't all that much better than just tinkering with the transparency. And Tableau's, for whatever reason, doesn't actually say Viritus, but density multicolor dark in the density color menu is Viritus. That's the only built-in version of Viritus in Tableau. In my other visualizations, I went to the preferences file and added in custom color palettes with Viritus in order to get the look on this one, for example.
Awesome. Awesome. And Steve, with this one, I love the, reference, the reference lines that you have in the background. Can you speak to how you created those?
Yeah, that is this view. So this is actually an area plot.
Okay.
And the color is driven by the same dimension color on my main scatter plot. And I've got I've got a data source here called cheat for background, in which I have values built in for the first and last data points that drive this area plot.
Okay, that's super helpful. Yeah.
And then I've got opacity here that I slide around until it looked right to me for background and foreground. You could also simply create a visual like this, use that as a background image. In some ways that is preferable, but I like to just do it in Tableau myself at that time.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks again, Steve.
Yeah. And then they're floated on top of each other. This actual foreground scatter plot has got transparent background color.
Got it. Yeah, that looks really cool. And yeah, I appreciate you walking us through that in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. All right. I did not see any questions or comments come through. But yes, this will be available as a recording. And Steve, again, very much appreciative of your time. Any other comments about scatter plots or anything in general?
Yeah, again, I just want to reiterate, if you are watching the recording and you have questions, I would not put them in the comments of the YouTube video. I probably won't get back to that very often, particularly since it won't be on my YouTube channel. But you can at me on Twitter at Stat Hunting, or you could send me a message on LinkedIn. I do check Twitter more often than LinkedIn, which is in some ways unfortunate because it is a bit of a hellscape. But so I'll see it more faster there. But I'd come across LinkedIn as well if you, for justifiable reasons, don't do Twitter.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again. I'm going to, we'll wrap this up here. So I'll take back control. And I'm just going to present real quick. So finally, just to wrap things up, like I said, our next meeting is going to be Thursday, June 9th. Again, hoping that we'll have that in person. More than likely, if we're able to get it in person, you know, all things considered, then we'll also have a virtual option as well. And we're always searching for different topics and different venues. So please, if you're if you have anything to offer in either of those categories, please do so. And again, don't forget to join us, Cleveland Tableau User Group on LinkedIn. So, all right, well, I'm going to stop with that. And everyone, thank you. And I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday.